From the Ash Rises a Phoenix, Chapter 11, written by Kangarooney. Aaron drifted in his saddle, head tilted back, eyes fixed on the stars and their twinkling lights. He couldn't tear his eyes away. The overbearing presence of branches, leaves, the foliage from before was gone now. It couldn't hide these lights and said, "Yes, you're going to make it." This was the same sky he would stare at every night in the Cadet Corps. In the beginning, Aaron was homesick. Commander Shottis told them he would run them into their graves, and only through their own perseverance would they be able to crawl back out of those muddy tombs. He hadn't lied. Boys who came from homes with food, girls who trained in anticipation of joining up, they would collapse to their hands and sob at the pain. Aaron couldn't even make it that far. Every night, when he should have been sleeping and regaining his depleted energy, Aaron had snuck onto the roof of his barracks and stared at the stars. They were the same stars he and Armin once looked upon with awe and wonder. They were the same that kept their hope burning while they counted their ribs. He had stood on the roof and sworn they would keep him strong. When he couldn't keep up with the once teary-eyed cadets, when he lagged far behind and saw the commander shake his head and turn away, Aaron crawled to the roof and cried. The stars were his only witness then, and they were his only witness now. Aaron let the memories wash through him and soaked in the silence of the stars. In the barracks, the stars danced infrequently. The light from the city blocked out their dim glow and hid any that darted across the sky. Now, out in the wild, surrounded by nature, Aaron watched the sky come alive. Big and little twinkled, winking in and out of sight. Others crossed the sky in seconds, free to wander as they pleased. Aaron tracked their movement with his eyes. Vaguely, he could feel the tension slip from his body. The strain in his neck wavered and eased. His shoulders slumped down, no longer held back with rigidity. Absent-minded, Aaron dropped the reins and let his hands loosen, fingers flexing and wiggling away the tension. He rolled his shoulders and sighed in relief. The entire time, his head stayed tilted back, eyes wide and reflecting the stars. One night, after a rough day in training, Aaron nearly fell asleep on the roof. Too tired to move back to his rack, he had lain down and spread his arms, wishing to join the stars in the sky. He blinked, and when he reopened his eyes, a pale figure was in his sight. "Listen, Jaeger," they'd said, crouching low. "If you want to succeed, you can't sleep here." Aaron had sat up so suddenly, the other figure barely avoided a collision of their skulls. "Jaeger," they whisper-yelled. "Oh, Lewert." He finally recognized the vaguely nasally voice. Dennis Lewert, from the same unit as Aaron, a boy of similar stature and nature. They both ignored the other and maintained their truce. "Jaeger." The other boy returned to his crouch. "We're representing the outer walls." Aaron only knew he smiled from the glint of light from his teeth. "We can't falter." Aaron hadn't known Lewert was from the outer wall. They never spoke to one another. Aaron never spoke to anyone. Aaron remembered returning to his rack that night, only to search out Lewert during mealtimes. That night on the roof was all they needed to form a fast friendship. They shared a few stories of their hometowns, but kept that conversation to a minimum. The loss stayed vivid despite the time that passed. Aaron and Lewert were comrades in arms and helped the other to grow better, faster, stronger. Aaron lost the right to call Lewert by his first name the moment Aaron abandoned him on the rooftop to die. Together, Aaron and Lewert focused on survival. They knew the horrors of invasion. It could happen again, and it did. Lewert's training didn't help in the end. Aaron owed his life to Lewert for pulling him off the rooftop that night. The stars were beautiful and free. The stars were dangerous, tempting. Aaron blinked. His eyes were dry, crusted. Had he blinked since he started his ruminating? He rubbed his face and looked away, towards the horizon, to see a hint of gray. The sky was growing lighter. The sun rose. Aaron knew at that moment that they wouldn't make it. With the sun would come the Titans, and with the Titans would come their deaths. Luert saved Aaron's life. Aaron failed Luert. Mikasa and Armin were Aaron's life. He couldn't fail them. He looked at the horizon, deciding no. The sun would bring titans, but that wouldn't stop him. Aaron was a titan. If he doubted Armin before, the little pieces he had noticed since Trost were too constant to ignore. Aaron was a titan. He needed to be a titan again to save them. He'd been able to transform before when his life was swallowed in Trost. The memory of Jean reaching to him on the roof of a building, a mouth open and voice silent, was seared in Aaron's mind. And a day ago, when his arm was mauled to the point of infection, he was able to heal and be the upright one who pushed the trio onward. Neither Armin nor Mikasa were conscious at this point. He chanced to glance over his shoulder. They were slumped in their saddles, bouncing on the horses' backs like sacks of freshly harvested grain straight from the fields. Only the ropes Aaron had insisted on held them up. Mikasa's head lolled over her mount's neck, arms dangling on either side. If she survived, she would be feeling that crick in her neck once they arrived. Aaron has channeled the power before, which means he can do it again. Aaron will shift into a titan, because otherwise Armin and Mikasa will die. He pulled his mount to a halt and stared at the pinkening sky. The gray that had forewarned the dawn was gone, chased away by the colors that light brought into the world. A blush of pink spreading from the horizon into the cloudless sky. Sun energized Aaron. If there were ever a time for him to use his powers, it would be during the daytime when he was the strongest. He needed to shift away from his family. Titans were massive. When Aaron shifts, he might crush Mikasa and Armin by being too close. He needed to move away to save them. As Aaron dropped the reins and wandered away, he thought the idea of leaving them to save them was wrong, and yet, why did it feel like it fit? Hadn't he left them in Trost to gain this knowledge that could save them? Was distance a necessity to save the ones you love? Luert was devoured because Aaron refused to save him. Mama was devoured because Aaron couldn't save her. Now, he stumbled over stones and tufts of grass, leaving Armin and Mikasa unconscious on the backs of decrepit animals in the hope that maybe he could save them. He will. He will. Aaron tripped and fell into the dirt. Dry and hard, it scraped his palms and brought him back to his body, away from his mind. He rolled to a seat and saw them 20 meters away. The horses shifted on their feet, nibbling the grass, but unable to move far, tied together as they were. Armin and Mikasa looked like bodies. Luert stood with his head tilted up at the Titan. He stood there, and when Aaron looked back, he was gone. Aaron blinked his eyes, and the image disappeared. 4 horses, 2 friends, that's all he saw. He couldn't save his ghosts, only the ones who were still alive. Sun peeked over the horizon. It lit up the silhouette of a lumbering figure headed their way. Save them. He closed his eyes, focused on feeling the energy the sun was giving him. His skin prickled, warmed by the light. He needed to save them and find water. He needed to save them and keep them from harm. He needed to save them and rekindle their friendships. Armin trusted him with his life. Aaron wanted to show Armin the feeling was mutual. Aaron inhaled slowly, tasted the dust in the air. He tasted the wind flowing through the grass, like every summer day when the hay was green and growing. Maybe this was an abandoned hayfield lost to the Titans. His heart rate slowed. Aaron pressed his palm to his chest and focused. Shift. Save them. He bit his lip, and it broke the skin. Thunder ricocheted in the clear sky, and Aaron's world was consumed in white. He stood in the same place, sand stretched out in eternity. As Aaron spun in a circle, all he saw was endless rolling hills of sand. Once, when Aaron was a child, before Mikasa came to live with them, his father traded medicines for a small bag of sugar. Look, Aaron. He'd knelt and dipped a finger in the bag. This is sugar. Aaron inspected the finger thoroughly. He remembered looking to his father and saying, It looks like salt. His father laughed, head thrown back and fist curled tight. Once he was able to pull himself together, he asked, "Now, where in the world have you seen salt?" Before Aaron, sand dunes the color of sugar and salt covered the land. He dropped to his knees and pinched a few granules, lifting them to his eyes, and wondered. This was the second time Aaron had visited this place. Only he came here. If it were a dream, wouldn't his family and friends join him? Would the sand taste like anything? He dropped the granules in his mouth, tasting. Sweet, salty, bitter. The flavor of blood? Save them. The brief numbness passed, and Aaron's body began processing the pain his mind had ignored. Sharp, digging, clawing, screaming. His body bent in half one way, then the next. He felt creeping fingers along his face. He knew he was screaming, or maybe he was screaming. His vocal cords snapped and rewove. His eardrums burst. He could hardly categorize every shredding force writ upon his body. One phrase, one focus, kept Aaron aware enough. Save them. Slowly, the pain blended. This allowed Aaron to notice a sliver of outside light. He saw the window and reached for it, somehow knowing this small glow was necessary. He opened his mind and looked outside. Outside, a pile of steaming corpses filled a path of destruction. In it, a train of four-legged animals limped along, picking their way after him. He was their leader. Where was he leading them? He, Aaron, didn't know where he was going or what was happening. Why was he fighting to look outside? Why was he worried about this train of beasts? All he knew was the pounding, repetitive desire to save them. Aaron's fingers scrabbled for a hold. The lip he held changed into a smooth and steaming wall. Yelling, Aaron slid back down. His mind crumbled under the weight of agony. Blood soaked his pores. Sweat soaked his blood, baked dry, acrid, sour. Aaron couldn't breathe. He wanted to vomit but couldn't remember who he was. He wiggled his tongue, but it was held in place. Some thing sucked on his palate. The bones of his teeth crumbled when he coughed, falling out and disintegrating the more he focused on them. Muscular tendons, soft as mud and hard as steel, attached to his lungs. He suffocated. Air, 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 air! Convulsively, he swallowed. The muscles of his throat tried to push the deformity down, away, anywhere. Instead, they tightened and flexed around the warm, moist... The warm, moist thing. Aaron couldn't follow his own thoughts to even describe what was happening. He tried to touch it with his hands, but discovered he was entirely fixed in place. Every inch of his skin had grotesque spider-like legs holding tightly. He wanted to close his eyes, but the same molten heat already vaporized his eyelids. His eyeballs had popped, the liquid caked on his cheeks, the rest dried like leaves in autumn. If he focused hard enough, he realized even with his eyesight gone, he could see vague spiderwebs keeping everything in place. With his lungs full of rigid muscle, Aaron couldn't breathe air. Instead, the viscous flow of blood carried oxygen through his ears directly to his brain. He wasn't sure if this ability to stay conscious despite being in an indeterminate state of decay was worth being alive. Save them. Aaron remembered his name and realized this state of being was all wrong. His blood should be more watery, should be on his inside, not his outside. His lungs should function. His eyes shouldn't be halfway down his face, caught in the coppery web of fungus tissue. Aaron knew this form shouldn't cause him such pain. Something was wrong when he changed. Aaron craved water. Save them. He stumbled on in this fashion. His self-awareness fluctuated. He found the window and its lip, and checked on the limping beasts. He slid back down and writhed among the flood of red. He couldn't say for how long this went on. He only knew that he was in this state and he was cold. Aaron flailed his arms. Unlike before, they followed his command and pushed through the cold, churning water. When he opened his mouth, he swallowed a mouthful of water, most of which ended in his lungs. Aaron coughed, which allowed more water to rush into his mouth. He needed to breathe again. His eyes opened, and he saw vague impressions of blue and green. Kicking his feet, Aaron surfaced and breathed at last. His vision adjusted as he blinked the water clear. He was treading water in a lake, surrounded by trees. They looked the same as the forest they'd left earlier that day. Aaron searched the shoreline, and once he saw their horses, he began to swim closer. Had Armin and Mikasa dismounted? Why was Aaron so far into the lake? The clump of horses slowly separated the closer he swam, until he could see that Armin and Mikasa were still tied to the backs of their mounts. Their saddles had loosened over time, and Aaron realized their horses had to lean far to one side to counter the new balance. Both of his friends dangled awkwardly, necks bent crookedly, and fingers nearly touching the ground. Walls above, how long had they been in this state? Aaron quickened his swim. Once the water was shallow enough for his feet to touch the bottom, he tried to put his weight on them, but quickly realized that while he felt better, his legs didn't. The water was acting like balm to his body. Aaron swam as far as he could until the water was too shallow. Then he crawled out on hands and knees. He saw how his skin steamed, what little of it there was. Skin formed small patches, barely covering visible muscle and tendons. When the loose flesh was exhibited to the open air, Aaron shouted in pain. His body begged him to roll back into the water, where the soothing liquid would knit his flesh back together. But his heart saw his friends' bodies and wondered if they were dead. Grunting, Aaron heaved himself further on land and ignored how the dirt and rocks from shore dug into his hands and knees. "Come here, horsey," he clicked his tongue, hoping the small group would recognize him and walk over. Thankfully, his mount did just that. Its ears perked, and cautiously it nickered and walked over. "Hey there, good boy." He pushed himself into a seat and held out a hand for it to investigate. His fingers had healed the quickest, which meant when the horse sniffed his hand, he felt its whiskers tickle. Aaron smiled at the feeling, unable to prevent the instinctive reaction and not wanting to. Unfortunately, Aaron couldn't spend much time letting the horse lip at his hand. He patted its head and looked at the two with his friends on their backs. They refused to come nearer, forcing Aaron to rise to his feet. His brief moment of respite was gone. His muscles ached at the unwanted movement. It took him more than 3 tries to stand upright, and that was while leaning against his horse. He chanced a step and immediately felt his legs give out. With a sharp cry, Aaron landed with a jolt to his knees. His vision blurred, and when he was able to clear it again, his face was only a few inches from the ground. His knuckles were white. His fingertips dug into the ground, and when he tried to lift a hand to crawl forward, his arms collapsed. Face first on the ground, Aaron's limbs refused to work. He flexed his toes and fingers. He could tilt his head so he could breathe. Any other movement was too much. Aaron's heart pounded, thump, bump, bump, until the sounds of bugs and other wildlife faded away. He blinked and saw nothing but darkness. Was it his heart beating, or was it the world shaking? The ground he laid on shifted and began to slide. He scrabbled at the earth, unable to catch a solid hold. His thoughts spun away. He tried to hold on. Aaron Yeager, find me.